Hi, this is Michael Waits, and welcome back to InsurTech Amplified. We are joined today by Jason Kaminsky, the CEO of kWh Analytics. It took me like a couple of seconds to figure out what that meant, but we'll let you go through that in a second. Jason, thank you so much for coming on the show. Before we jump into the main part of this conversation, let's give our listeners a little bit of your background for some context.
Sure. Well, Michael, I'll say thank you for having me. Whatever time zone you're in, I think we are 12 hours apart or close to that today.
Something like that.
Yeah, so I'm Jason Kaminsky. My background, I usually say my background's in renewable energy, which is true. Although now more than half my career has also been insurance. So I've been doing renewable energy for about 15 years, spanning solar development and banking finance. So project finance for renewable energy assets. And then the past 10 years or so at kWh Analytics. And you're right, kWh originally stands for kilowatt hour. So
I like it.
Electrons coming through your wall. And yeah, so that's my background today. kWh Analytics is really a leading MGA in the renewable energy space, and I'm sure we'll talk more about what that means. But that's been my
we'll
journey.
Get to what an MGA means in a moment.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, I just said we'll get to what I think most people who listen know what an MGA is, but for the few people that don't, we'll get to what that means in a second. But before we get there, let's have a high level question. Give me like a unique, maybe not the most unique, but a unique perspective that you have or your firm has on the risks that are affecting renewable energy in the United States. Like, why do we care about this? What's so unique about this? Why does it matter?
Yeah, so renewable energy, just for context, for most of what I'll be talking about is solar, battery storage, and wind. My background happens to be solar. I think the thing that is maybe the trickiest thing to get your arms around is that as an industry, we've been really, really good at being a deflationary industry. So squeezing every penny out of every electron that comes out of this equipment just to be competitive. And only in the last 3 or 4 years has really insurance become a key deal point and a key cost driver and cost factor. So this idea of designing for resilience, which in our lexicon means, being able to withstand the natural environment in which it's built, is really still a relatively new concept and a big cultural shift for a lot of the owners of these assets in the United States, and I'd argue globally as well.
So what drove this change, right? In other words, you said they're trying to grab every little piece of cost out of this to make it effective and efficient. Where does insurance play a role in doing that? And even if it doesn't, why did people start thinking about, hey, maybe we need to insure this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's honestly a little bit of the change in geographies and the hazards in which they're built. So a lot of our emphasis today, a lot of our business is around property insurance for these assets. So think of fire, flood, earthquake, and in particular, hail. And here in the United States, Texas has gone from a market that no one had spent any time in to really the number one market, I'll say overnight, but really over the last few years. Yep. And as a result, if you know the US geography, that's our hail alley, tornado alley, I guess in insurance terms, the severe convective storm zones. And it was really a consequence of some pretty material losses that the industry faced on the insurance side, primarily driven by hail, that led to an entire dramatic radical change of the way that our market operates and has pushed a lot more risk and a lot more expense onto the developers. And we could talk more about that dynamic. That sort of forced this change, that it became a risk factor that people were not paying attention to until, let's call it 4 years ago.
So you said the developers. Which developers exactly are you talking about?
Good question. So I use developer to mean someone who's finding a plot of land to build a renewable energy asset. And usually the solar industry, we say developer is also the long-term owner of those assets. So developer, owner, independent power producer, I sort of use interchangeably, but you're right. It's going to be someone who's building a facility, may or may not be the same company that's owning that facility for the long term, but they're typically making the design, procurement, construction decisions.
So what is the impact of something that happened just a couple of weeks ago in the United States, like these really big hurricanes, Helene and Milton, if I have their names correct, right?
Correct.
Because if they're coming in, I don't know the whole path of the storm, right? But if it's coming through Florida into the Carolinas and stuff like that, there must be wind energy there. There must be solar energy there. What is the impact of something like that?
It's a great question. So there's two facets to that question. One is where is renewable energy built? And then the second is how resilient is it to events? So let me sort of take those in turn. When we look at renewable energy with a broader insurance lens, we tend to say it's very complementary to a portfolio that a property insurance underwriter would otherwise write. Like, we're building this equipment. It's high value equipment, but it's in generally rural zones, cheap land. So if you're an insurance actuary and you're thinking about accumulations of risk and sort of correlations of risk, it's a generally lowly correlated book against high value properties. And also the zones that people really, really care about, which is Florida hurricane is like one of the hardest risks to write in the United States. Tier 1 counties, so basically coastal counties and Gulf counties, tends to be pretty light in solar and wind generally. So I'll just sort of say that as a premise. We think it's a good complement to other property portfolios. Second to that, you look at we call the resilience to storms. And actually, if you read some of the news coming out of those two events in particular, solar ended up being very, very resilient to those hurricanes. So you can design to high wind speed. You can design to sort of the events. Now, were people expecting Asheville, North Carolina to be totally flooded and like secluded? No. You know, can you put power onto the grid when there's otherwise a grid event? No. Actually, the regulations here say even if you have a solar project, that's fine. You can't inject it into the grid because you don't want to harm a line worker. So the physical assets themselves, I haven't seen stats yet. We're sitting here at the end of October on sort of the impact on the solar industry, but I also haven't heard of any rumors of significant losses from those events. And if anything, I've seen some headlines that said the solar has been pretty resilient to hurricanes, and we've seen that in prior events as well.
So I was in one of the largest earthquakes, well, not exactly in the epicenter of this earthquake, but in 2011, there was an earthquake off the coast of Fukushima, right? And it sent a massive tsunami into the nuclear power plant there, which caused some problems. The shaking that we had in Tokyo proper, where I was on the 20th floor of a building that was like 20-something years old, but nothing fell down. And this earthquake was massive. And I'd been living in Japan at the time for 20-something years. Right. And there are little earthquakes every single day, and you just kind of get used to it. People joke about it like, well, another earthquake. But this one was serious. But the Japanese have done a ton of work on the building specs, particularly in the big cities. And I'm just curious, like, how actively involved insurers, governments, like what is the aspect of that happens here to make sure that those solar installations, because we're talking about solar, are so resilient, given the fact, right, that are they built on flat land? Are they built on the side of mountains? Like, where are they normally built, and how much stuff is done to make them resilient, if that makes sense?
Yes, that's a great question. My earliest big earthquake was Northridge, and I was a kid at the time, so I was at, I think, early 90s. But yeah, that one I definitely felt. I was an hour from the epicenter by car. In any event, so let's talk about that. I like to think of it as almost three areas of insurance, and we're in the third era, which is the one about designing for resilience, but it's worthwhile touching on the other two. And I think the U.S. in some ways is globally a little bit ahead of the curve. So this timeline is the U.S. timeline, which may or may not reflect the global timeline. But pre-2019, it was it was what we talked about at the start, right? Just build the cheapest panel you can. When I entered the industry 15 years ago, a solar module cost, we measure it in dollars per watt, that's sort of per unit of energy. It costs like $4 a watt. Today, they're 10 cents a watt. Wow. Talk about deflationary economics. You know, it's sort of like the more you manufacture, the cheaper things get. Okay, so that's pre-2019. The industry is moving into Texas and just sort of more parts of the United States generally. We had some pretty massive hail events in 2019. There's one very well publicized one called Midway, $80 million loss that flowed through the insurance and reinsurance markets for a solar project due to hail. And that was, I'll call it the beginning of some changes. And the backdrop is a hardening property market generally, with a big loss in our space. So you had deductibles step up, rates increase, and importantly, sublimits. So can't get full natural catastrophe limits anymore, but just sort of lower sublimits for those, as well as some change in the terms and conditions. And that trend has really continued from 2020 through today. And then, you know, as a result of that, we had researchers beginning to look at hail. We had testing labs begin to shoot hail at this equipment in labs, and not just small hail, but big hail, different parts of the module. We put out a report called the Solar Risk Assessment every year. And this year they're shooting hail at the frames of the module to see what would happen. People were looking at how the tilt of the modules impacted. So there's a lot of research that came out, a lot of insights that was generated as a result of that. Are those in building standards? Absolutely not. Are many insurers even experts in this? Absolutely not. We this is what we do all day. So we think we're ahead of the curve and probably one of the foremost experts on this topic. And you actually know who ends up being a force of change in many respects is the banks. So all of this is infrastructure.
Because they're lending to build?
They're lending to build, and they're putting their own design requirements. So my background, I sort of glazed over this in the intro, but I was a project finance banker for 4 years. Yep. And as an insurer now, we're representing insurers, we get a week to underwrite a project, right? A submission comes in. Sometimes the broker needs it. I mean, we closed our first 24-hour turnaround from the day we got the submission to the day we bound it, 24 hours. So we were able to do a lot of data analysis and look at what was in the submission, but you don't have the opportunity to enforce change on a case-by-case basis. When you're at a bank and you're putting out $100 million of proprietary capital, that's a 6-month project, right? That's a 6-month effort. Yeah. You're looking at every piece of the design. You're looking at who's doing the operations. You're able to enforce a little bit more change. And we've seen that. So we've seen now actually the financiers come in and say, you know, if you're going to be building in Texas, we need to see a report that this equipment is better able to withstand the hail or able to stow at a better tilt. And we view our role as, again, representing insurers, but one of the foremost thought leaders on resiliency. We put out a lot of research. We give a lot of feedback to our clients. When we decline an account or it doesn't meet our risk appetite, we tell them why and what they could do better. But we're still, I guess we're in the third era of Build for Resilience, but we're still in the very early days of that era. I think if you go to many developers, to use the term of art again, and say, hey, you have a solar project here. What risks is it exposed to and how are you designing to address those? I'd be willing to guess you still get very uncertain answers from a very large majority of the market today. I think that'll change and it is changing. And culturally, people are saying, hey, we should invest in these things. It's sort of anathema to how we've been trained, but we need to do it. And, you know, the capital providers are the ones that are, I'd say maybe partners with insurance companies, right? I mean, it's all, no one wants a bad asset, but someone's got to pay for it. And there's different points of leverage. And I'd say many times the bank has more leverage than us as the carrier, from being honest.
Well, I mean, it's at some level, their money's the first money that's at risk, right? Because they're the ones that are funding this stuff. I have a question about data, right? You said, if I remember correctly, you said a couple of minutes ago, you have like you had 24 hours to underwrite this thing. I'm super curious about not the math specifically, but like, how do you leverage all of this data? Like, where does the data that you have come from? How is it relevant? And is there an emerging technology aspect to this, whether it's artificial intelligence or machine learning? Like, how does all that stuff come and play together from a tech perspective?
That's a very good question, and I'll try to be concise in my answer. Let me give a little bit of background of the company, just for context. So we actually started as a data company. I came out of banking, joined another entrepreneur, and the idea was, how do we collect a bunch of data about this asset class? I'm having a BBC moment. I don't know if you can hear my kid in the background trying to.
I told you. Good. Go ahead.
Anyway, how do we collect a bunch of data about this asset class and then use it to make better investment decisions? That was the founding thesis. Insurance was not the founding thesis, but we have a very, very, very large data set of locations, technologies, performance, and losses. So we actually have $100 billion of loss data, not because we wrote $100 billion of risk that we lost, but because it's data we've collected from the industry. Okay. We use that now to refine the underwriting models, and in particular, the natural catastrophe models. So at a very, very high level, a natural catastrophe model is a set of events, and then how those events impact a specific asset class or asset of interest. Set of events, there's lots of places you can buy that. RMS, AIR, CoreLogic. There's companies that sell that modeling software.
Got it.
We're experts in how that affects the underlying asset class. So we use all of our data to inform what we call the damage curves for those assets. And we think we have the best model for that globally and how these assets are impacted. So when we get a submission, yeah, we run it through our proprietary models that are really tuned for this asset class. And we're able to have a lot of confidence in what those models are saying. And we built a lot of infrastructure to allow us to do that in a reasonably automated fashion. Or, there's a lot of policy structures that need to take into account, whether it's location level limits or aggregate limits or annual limits, or there's the stuff that the engineering team does to model all of that's quite impressive, I'd say. And then, it's a bit of, at the end of the day, an underwriter it's a fascinating job to me because you have to be a technical expert, but you also need to be able to negotiate a deal and structure a deal in a way that works best for the client and the carrier, right? It's sort of this hybrid role. So we were on the phone with the broker, in that 24-hour period 10 times trying to figure out what's the right deal structure, how to meet everyone's needs. And everything came together. But you're right, there's a lot of technology we used in advance of that to have a lot of confidence in the results of our models, be able to model the deal structure in a very precise but quick way. We even do stuff like, these are big power plants, right? If you have a $100 million power plant, I'm talking square miles, right?
Yeah,
and
it's huge.
Flood maps are very, if you're in a flood zone, that's a very location specific question, right? And we have to make sure we're modeling that. So we actually take those square miles and we break it up into 100 different data points, and we model it 100 different times to make sure that we know the risk at each of those locations. And then we reaggregate it together. So there's a lot of stuff we're doing that I'd say is very tailored for our segment, probably as applications outside of our segment, but tailored to our segment to make sure we're really getting the best view of the risk, to provide that experience to the brokers, because, it was needed to get that deal done. And I think we proved to be a good business partner.
So I'm going to make a guess here. You said the thesis around the company was originally to understand the impact. You were a data company, so you gather all this data from multiple sources, and then you start analyzing that data. You said you guys do a ton of research as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then the insurance angle came into play.
Mm-hmm.
But now that you're in that domain, do you find yourself working directly with the developers, and they say to you, in conjunction with them, and they say, we want to build this thing in Oklahoma, right? Or in Montana, where there's big sky and all this other stuff and lots of exposure to sun. I'm just making it up, right? Because I'm not a solar expert. And do you then go out and proactively gather more data around that space, what the weather history's been like, what, the tornado history's been like, all this stuff, and then say to them, here's what the risk assessment looks like from our perspective. Not that it's either okay or not okay to build there, but here are the risks you're going to come up against, and here's how it may get priced from an insurance perspective in a proactive way, not in a reactive way. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, let me answer actually the question that we had said at the top, which is what is an MG?
Go ahead.
And then I'll answer that question in particular.
Perfect.
Because I think that'll be useful context for my answer. So an MGA is a managing general agent. And what that means is that we functionally represent insurance companies in underwriting specialty risks. And our specialty and specialization is renewable energy.
They allocate capacity to you, which you can take risk with. Yeah.
Correct. And the best analogy I've heard, although there's many differences, but I'm big on analogies, is that if you're a pension fund or an endowment, you think about diversifying your risk pool, and you end up giving capital to a private equity fund to invest, right?
Yep, you give it to a fund manager to handle.
You give it to a fund manager, and they make the decisions, and they get a return, and you write the check. It's sort of similar for insurance, except instead of a check, you're getting a piece of a balance sheet, right? So we get authority to make the decisions on their behalf. If there's a loss, they make the claim payment, but we're deemed the expert in this arena and are given that right to make those decisions in the same way a private equity fund might deploy a pension capital. So that's our business model. We distribute through brokers, right? Which is typically the interface with the end client. So client, broker, MGA, carrier, reinsurer. That's sort of the value chain. So usually my question or my answer for you, Michael, would say that's the broker in many ways. Is the one who's sort of working with the client on the front lines. That being said, we're the only underwriting team that came from the industry. So the developer executives are our friends. I hate to be so glib about it, but we've worked and grown up in this industry together, and we get those calls. People ask us hey, I have this project. It's in Louisiana behind the levees. And it's
Right.
like, I need to decide whether to put down an interconnect deposit, which is a couple $100,000. Like, should I do it? So we actually took that need and we brought it, of all places, to the Department of Energy. And the DOE has a bunch of funding that they put out. And we said there's not tools that help developers both identify what risks they could be facing and then making those decisions that they need to make at the right stage of the process. So do you need a hail resilient module if you have a project in Maine? Probably not, because there's not really hail in Maine, right? But you really, really, really need it in Texas. But do you need to elevate your modules for flooding on top of a mountain? Probably not, but you do if you're in Western North Carolina, as it turned out. So we actually got some funding from the DOE that we're in the process of negotiating now. The project will start early next year. But the idea is to build some tools that can be pushed, call it, earlier into that design and development process that can help people identify what are those risks. Because like I don't know, I did banking for 4 years. I know a lot about solar. I knew literally zero about NatCat, natural catastrophe risks, in my 2 years of solar development and 4 years of banking. Like, it's not a risk you think about. And it's not, I mean, now people are, because it's, becoming, insurance has moved to the number one cost driver. But there's a whole depth of knowledge and expertise there that we think better tools can help ultimately drive better decision making and better quality assets, which is what we're after in the end.
If you're gathering all this data, if you've built some of the most sophisticated analysis tools, if you're and you're an MGA, right? Mm-hmm. And you're connected to the developers at some level, because you said they're your friends, but you also have this value chain that you noted before, right? All the way from the developers all the way out to the insurers and the reinsurers. Mm-hmm. Is there a business model that allows you to sell like that analysis that you do as a service? Do you know what I mean? Have access to that data, have access to the results of the analysis that you do there so that you can scale? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, probably. I say today our interest is, we view those best quality assets as the best assets that we want to write. So today we're doing it because we want people to bring us higher quality assets to get a preferred book of business. Like for an MGA, our goals are twofold: grow, right? Write premium for our partners, and write good quality business. If we're writing a bunch of, I call it, really bad losses, right, then we're losing money for ourselves and for our carriers. So that's been our primary interest today, is how do we educate people to bring us business that we want to write, and that we think we can make, ultimately make a profit on a diversified basis, but provide the right risk capital. Maybe you're right, Michael. Maybe in the future, we're always thinking about what is the right way to quote unquote monetize our data. And there's lots of opportunity to do so. It's just finding the right business models. And, ultimately, we respect the brokers and their relationships. We're not trying to get in the way of that, but we're trying to provide tools that can benefit everyone.
Exactly. And that was, I guess, my point, is that some of those tools you have that you use internally could be used externally, but we'll leave that for another time. Is there, because you're operating in this resilient space, right? Some of the data that you're getting is real time, right? Like the winds are getting higher, the rain is really driving, and all this other kind of stuff is happening.
Yeah.
Do solar installations put sensors on them as well that allow you then to create parametric, or even like, what would I call it? Para indemnity insurance. Do you know what I mean? Where it's a little bit of a hybrid product around the types of impact that it can have and the risks that you can mitigate using parametric insurance as well.
Yeah. Again, let me pull apart a few facets of that question. So part of the reason, if I go back to the Department of Energy award, part of one of the interesting dynamics that I've always been fascinated by, because I've worked now in all three segments, is a developer is taking a 30 to 40 year view, right? Part of your question was like, how is this changing over time? So if you're picking a location, you're stuck there for 40 years. You're not going to move that asset once it's in the ground. If you're a banker, you're maybe structuring a 10, 12-year loan investment structure. So you still have a pretty long horizon. If you're an insurance company, you take a 12-month view, right? So we don't like the risk in a location. Next year, our prices go up and our deductibles go up. Like, that's sort of the nature of it. So that's also part of that tension of what decision to make. Is people ask their broker, well, am I going to save money if I make this decision? Actually, kWh is unique. I think we're the only company that will price in some of those decisions to our insurance pricing. most of the market doesn't have the sophistication to do that. But I think over the long arc, yeah, it will be reflected in insurance prices. And, you have to sort of know how these perils are changing. Okay, now with parametric, parametric we've seen. So yes, they all have sensors. Let me answer that, right? You're typically measuring the sunlight, measuring the wind speed. They're doing that really for their monitoring of the production for the most part. Parametric, I'd say, hasn't had a ton of uptake in our industry, just generally, because you have a banker, so go back to them at the end of the day, who doesn't really know how to quantify 3-inch hail or 55-mile-an-hour wind speeds. They sort of just know, I don't want to lose my investment. So they want a better indemnity product than parametric. But we actually did close earlier this year a parametric product with Munich Re, which is a wind speed parametric. So totally different thesis altogether, but this is actually our first sets of products that we run in the insurance space. We're taking revenue volatility, which in project finance is really production volatility. They're highly correlated. And saying there's certain risks that are tail risks, which are perfect for insurance and not good for commercial banks, that are on this sort of like probability curve of production outcomes. So basically take a wind farm, think of the very, very low wind speed events when your wind turbines aren't turning on, you're not selling electricity, there's not enough revenue to service the loan. In those instances, we structured a deal where essentially Munich Re is injecting capital into the project so that the lender's made whole. So that you can do on a parametric basis because, it's measurable, pretty quantifiable. You know what you're going to get for the electricity when it's generated. But I don't know, if I think back to your earlier question as far as what's a unique take, or forget exactly the way you phrased it. The other one I think that's really, really important is there's trillions of dollars going into the clean energy transition. It's all, large majority, if not all, project finance capital, right? It's infrastructure capital, long-term capital. And if you don't understand project finance, it's hard to understand how the insurance is enabling these deals to happen. And I would say if you're like an underwriter or someone who's interested in the space, like go find a project finance class. Like it's bar none, I think, a skill set that is deficient in the insurance segment, but really, really important to understanding how all these deals come together.
But I mean, maybe it's deficient because it wasn't really necessary to know that up until now, right? Because you're definitely insuring and funding things that hadn't really been insured before, right? I mean, and that's the beauty of kWh. No, I mean, is that you're doing things that no one's done before. Yeah,
I agree. Yeah, I'm not casting aspersions at anyone for not
knowing. No, I know. I'm just making the point.
I think it's a skill set that, especially as we look at emerging technologies, like I've been part of conferences and discussions where we're like, what are the right products for hydrogen or small nuclear or direct air capture or all these emerging technologies, which are still very, very nascent. And the conversations very quickly go to, how do we collect data? How do we get buyers clubs? But it's like, the question that I think is most important is, what product do they need to go attract capital? Because it might not be the product that we have today as an industry. And that ultimately comes back to the project finance skill set to say, it's very funny. Project finance is what risks exist and who can wear it best. And then you allocate it. That's project finance, right? And insurance is what risks exist and how do you price it? So there's certain risks that get allocated to the insurance company, but it's sort of subject to each deal and what appetite the equity and the debt have to. If neither of them want it, then that's a good opportunity for an insurance company to write it.
But it feels like they're like flip sides of the same coin. Like those two things should go together way better than maybe they have in the past. Is that not the case?
Oh, 100%. No, I agree with you. I think that's what I'm saying. You're just saying it more concisely than me. Like it's like insurance is a exceedingly powerful form of contingent capital, risk capital that plays beautifully in a project finance structure. It's perceived as, hey, this is a cost center. Someone's making me buy it. But it's incredibly powerful from a risk allocation perspective. That's exactly what I'm saying.
I think the more you dig into like what insurance really is, I think for an outsider looking in, they're just like, that's just a cost that I have to bear. But once you get inside of it, you realize that it's not that at all. Exactly. I think after all the recordings and all the sort of, I don't want to say interviews, but all the conversations that I've had about insurance in the last like 5 years, that's one of the biggest things that's learned is that like, it's not what you think it is, right?
Yeah. Well, if you drop into project finance, I'm not going to say you can learn it over an online course, but I did 4 years at Wells Fargo, probably fastest pace of learning, like everything, is the first 2 years. And then you sort of get a sense
Right.
of what you're doing. And then our company, kWh, is moving into insurance. I got my broker license. I was studying the dynamics, let's say another 18 months, 2 years. At the end of it, you're like, holy smokes, they're both structured finance. Like,
Yeah.
all the terms are different, and like there's some nuances around the edges, but they're really, really similar. And just it just takes a while to build that mental map to say, okay, we have a syndicated deal in banking, we have a quota share deal in insurance. But anyway, like a lot of the structures are very similar. You just have to sort of draw those connections.
I do this all the time. My last job in finance was working and managing a portfolio trading desk.
That's right.
And when I look at what actuaries do, when I look at what insurance companies do, and like you said, they're writing a book, like we used to talk about what our book looks like. All these things sound very familiar to me from a risk calculation standpoint, a risk mitigation standpoint, or like, do I really want to be in this position? How do I lay off this position? How do I hedge this position? How do I get away from correlation? Right? Mm-hmm. All these things sound exactly the same to me as sitting on a portfolio trading desk. Mm-hmm. The tools you use are different. Maybe the outcomes are different, but at the end of the day, the thought process to me sounds very similar. No,
absolutely. I say, and one of the biggest cultural differences that makes insurance powerful is if you have a loss in a bank, people get really agitated by it.
Very agitated.
Like, there's workout groups, there's reporting. So you're by default taking a conservative position. And that's been the biggest cultural change, is that insurance is more risk on. Like, you get paid to take the risk and you get paid to take a loss. And if you have a claim, people understand that. And what do you learn from it? I mean, you still have to write a profitable book of business, but many of the tools are the same. Many of the concepts are the same. And that's what I think makes insurance such a powerful tool, is you can take low frequency, higher severity events and push into a market that's able to absorb that and a much more diversified. I would say insurance as well, at least compared to project finance, diversification is a much broader, like a much more ingrained theme. We wouldn't do a deal at Wells Fargo if we didn't love it on its own basis. And in insurance, it can be a non-correlated sort of diversifying risk, and it some ways is additive, even if it's not the best deal that's ever existed.
Can I ask you this? You hinted earlier, you're like, after we've done all this work and done all this analysis and built all these tools, there actually may be some applications of this outside of renewable energy. Where do you think that might be? And if you can remove the hint and give the actual thought process that you have.
It's a good question. So today our focus is property related risks and some of those revenue risks for renewable assets. When I look forward, believe it or not, tax related risks. So all these tax credits that are generated by renewable projects in the US, get insurance for them. And that actually is what I underwrote at Wells Fargo, was tax related risks for the bank. And one of the key risks embedded in that, I'm sort of skipping over a lot of steps here, but it's actually property related risks. So we think that there's other adjacent markets that we have a very unique view on. More broadly, what I'd say is we've created a lot of technology for ourselves to stay out of trouble. So we have monthly reporting to our carriers and reinsurers about what we're on risk. We've automated that process. We have a database with every project. We can run it through the NatCat models. We can generate a border risk. We've automated our natural catastrophe modeling, right? So we fill out an Excel sheet with all the values. We push it through. We get a result back in an hour. We're beginning to deploy AI more to say, we get a submission. We're in a very highly specialized industry, right? So every submission is its own ball of wax. It's just own 40 files at a box.com account. So we've created technology to go in and at least tell the broker right away, is this what we want? Like, what are you missing? Let's give you some feedback on it. Give tools to our underwriters to say, which of these talk about flood? And it might not be the word flood, but it might talk about elevation or things related to flood. And the AI is able to figure that out and make it more efficient. That's like human in the loop AI. So we're beginning to deploy those technologies for our own benefit. Whether or not those are applicable more broadly, probably. We're still focused on we're a small company, we're 30 people. So we got to focus on making sure we're growing sustainably and writing the best quality business. But when you have a NatCat model and you have a lot of automation, you have a lot of tools that your underwriters are using, I'd like to think that they could be applied in other ways.
I'm
but
sure
that's
they
probably a future effort for us to spend a lot more time thinking about that outside of, I'll call it the renewables context.
So how long have you been building this company?
The company was founded about 10 years ago.
Okay, so 10 years ago.
We've been doing
That's a good
insurance
thing.
for 8 or 9, say 7 of those years.
Okay, that's good, because a lot of things have changed. And you mentioned artificial intelligence. I wasn't going to go there because I thought it might bore you. But the lay of the land, right? The landscape of the way artificial insurance is getting used today is way different than it was when you started kWh. Like, it just is way different. And I'm curious, like, there's no like fixed answer, but you must think about it and deal with it and work with your team about this every day.
Yeah.
What are some of the things you're seeing, or some of the use cases you're seeing for like deeply embedded artificial intelligence in the kinds of things that you're doing, from simple things like just going to analyze that file structure in box.com, do you know what I mean? To more important things about how can we use AI to help us be more specific in our underwriting?
Yeah. I'm so conflicted on AI. It feel like part of me feels like
it's not
I just came
you.
back from InsurTech Connect. Yeah. And it's, you talk to people smarter than me about AI, and a lot of them are like, these don't really solve use cases for the insurance user. So we've started with how do we use it internally, and our CTO has a lot of experience, and he's like, start with automation, start with the groundwork you need before you throw AI at it. I think one of the challenges is, every week I get a different answer about what's the best model. Like one week it's Google's model, one week it's Meta's model, one week it's OpenAI's model. So building architecture that's flexible enough to address that, I think is a challenge. That being said, we're looking at it as how do we use technology to help us scale more efficiently without having underwriters just throw at the problem, and get more consistency in our underwriting view and make our underwriters more high powered than if they were anywhere else. So part of that is, teeing up the underwriting insights they need to make those decisions more quickly. So we could do a quote in 24 hours. Part of it is, we call it wowing the broker, but what are the things we can do with technology that allow us to provide a better customer experience? Like, even in a market that's a hard market growing fast, there's incumbents on accounts, and they're the incumbent for a reason. They're more likely to get that renewal. So how do we do things that when they need help, they think of us first, right? We're still relatively the new kids on the block. So I call it sales efforts there. And then for sure, using it to inform our modeling, right? To get a better loss ratio, to get better risk assessment. So I say we are ourselves cautiously optimistic about it. I'd say we're in the early days of our AI strategy, but it's beginning to show some pretty fruitful results already. And I don't know, the whole thing's just so incredible to me how it's changed. I mean, it is changing day by day and week by week. And I'm realizing myself as an executive, like, I'm not using it enough. Like, I don't have OpenAI open and using it as a way to push my creativity. I probably need to build more habits myself of using it in my day-to-day business.
I use some sort of artificial intelligence tool every single day. I couldn't do what I did without it. And if I look back on how I used to do many of the things, or multiple of the things that I used to do, and I'm still having the same output today, but the artificial intelligence has made me way more efficient. I like the answer that your internal CTOs been giving you. Start with the automation first.
Yeah.
And it's a great way to test it, right? It's like, I want to juggle like knives that are lit on fire, but I'm just going to start with 3 tennis balls, because once I can understand what juggling really means, then I can understand like how to light stuff on fire and mitigate that risk. But I will say this, and then I'll let you go. The guys and gals that you've put in quotes that are much smarter than you are, which I think it's hard to find those people, to be fair, Jason, but humility is a great skill to have. That say there are no great use cases for this means that they're just not trying hard enough to try to find what they are. And again, I'm not casting aspersions on anybody in particular, but it's an interesting answer in the context of so many people are using it for so many things every single day. And I could probably give you 5 places in the insurance industry where I know people are using it because I talk to so many different people, and it's definitely going to be helpful. If nothing else, here's the thing. We did this on the trading desk at Goldman Sachs. Okay. It didn't eliminate the traders, but just like you said, if it can superpower your actuaries, right, by giving them the ability to do analysis way faster, that alone is worth the price of admission. No?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe I should clarify even my comments. I think it's that there's so many, you go like ITC, right? There's so many companies tackling this space that maybe there's a saturation and there are, it's not to say there's definitely use cases, right? We're doing, as you said, Michael, there's very successful AI companies in the space. So I don't want to denigrate any of that for sure. If there's use cases and there's great companies being built there. I think there's also just a lot of, we're in the hype of the hype cycle, right? So there's also a lot of companies that probably don't have great use cases.
That's for sure.
I don't know who those are and which ones are good or not, but all I know is that we're using it internally and we're finding great results from it. I imagine that can be replicated throughout the industry. So
awesome. Jason Kaminsky, the CEO of kWh Analytics. This was awesome. I'm already inviting you back because there's so much more stuff to cover. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. Thank you again so much for your time, man.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate it.